Welcome to Behavior and Risk, where we explore the intersection of decisions, the brain, uncertainty, and the business world. I'm John Burkhart.
And I'm Rich Loria.
We're glad you took a chance on us today. 3M is an industrial titan. Founded in 1902, it's grown from a five-man mining operation to a multinational giant with 2024 revenues approaching $24.5 billion. 3M's product portfolio is likewise enormous. Tapes and adhesives, respirator masks, water filters, sponges, lint remover, boat wax, even Post-it notes. It's virtually impossible to go through a normal day without encountering at least a handful of 3M products. While the scope of products is phenomenally broad, there's a common thread that connects all of them: the clever and novel use of applied chemistry. In 1947, as part of its applied chemistry, 3M began large-scale production of polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. PFAS is a large class of compounds, more than 7 million in total, that are omnipresent throughout contemporary products. The full list is far too large to go into, but includes such things as nylon, Teflon, modern plastics, shampoos, paint, adhesives, and cosmetics. They're everywhere. As early as 1950, internal studies at 3M suggest that PFAS could be problematic for mammals. By 1963, 3M's technical manual deemed PFAS to be toxic. However, this in no way impacted 3M's production, and indeed, they only increased production of PFAS over the following decades. The paper trail is a bit murky, but the absolute latest that 3M executives could have learned about PFAS toxicity was 1979, when a technical consultant informed the executive team that PFAS were highly problematic. And in response, the executives did nothing. And they continued to do nothing for 40 years, across 9 different CEOs, despite repeated and ongoing pressure from internal science and engineering teams. It wasn't until a 2010 lawsuit by the state of Minnesota that 3M was forced to actually face facts. Even then, the settlement agreement wasn't reached until 2018, and in 2022, 3M announced that they would fully exit PFAS manufacturing by the end of 2025. This is a mess. The true scope of impact here is impossible to know, but it's almost certainly greater than what the financial penalties are. PFAS are known carcinogens. There's a Superfund site in Minnesota that is entirely 3M's responsibility, and uncountable numbers of people in the region and around the country have consumed PFAS for decades. And all of this was foreseeable decades ago. So why did this happen? It would be easy to explain away the bad actions of a single individual, one CEO with hyper-focus on profit, or one scientist who felt some skewed moral imperative. But an entire organization across decades, across 9 consecutive CEOs, what happened?
So thank you, John. That was well teed up for our audience. As I was listening to your opening, what struck me is that this is a huge case of loss aversion, and perhaps even loss aversion on steroids. It seemed that anybody who could make a decision at 3M made the decision to continually kick the can down the road, not wanting to face the ultimate cost of polluting the planet. So what I think we've seen over these last several decades is a continual pattern of let's try to keep stretching this out as far as we can, because as you taught me a long time ago, any organism is wired to survive and reproduce. And in this case, we're talking about the survival of 3M. Because even as one of its scientists who was quoted well after the fact said, as soon as he knew what was going on, as soon as he understood all the facts, his thoughts were, end quote, we're screwed.
I agree with that entirely. I think that there are a number of other factors that interact here, but loss aversion is a key one, simply because, especially back in the 40s, 50s, PFAS-derived products made up an enormous percentage of 3M's portfolio. At that point, and even into the 70s, eliminating or even just reducing production of PFAS would have entailed anywhere from a 20 to 50% reduction in market in product sales. at the time, there were really no replacements for PFAS. In the last 10, 20 years, there's been advancements in chemistry that allow for safer replacements for this class of compounds. But at the time, there really was none. And so their option was, okay, we can stop producing these and lose half of our sales, or we can do nothing and cross our fingers. And that's a huge loss that they're looking at when they really are and continue to be the leader in applied chemistry products. And I think that there are a lot of other things that interact with this. I think that the colloquial description of PFAS as forever compounds, because of how long they take to break down, create a kind of helplessness around it. Once they've been made, once you've been producing them, if they're forever compounds, well, what can you do about it? Reducing production won't do anything to mitigate those ones that are already out there in the world. And so there's a sense of why bother? Or at least I'm saying this, I'm asserting that this is how they were thinking. I could see a sense of why bother that then goes into this loss aversion calculation.
John, those are all good points. And I would add a little bit more color for our audience that as far as the monetary part of it, PFAS created products by 3M were generating, even as soon as 25 years ago, we're still producing on the order of 500 million of revenue for the company. That's a lot of revenue to try to make up elsewhere, even for a company the size of 3M. So using prospect theory terms, it's clear to me that what they saw was an absolute certain loss of, as you said, call it half their business versus an uncertain loss of whatever it would be in terms of legal costs, environmental cleanup, and so forth.
And that uncertain loss, I think there are some really important dynamics around that. We've talked in the past in various capacities about normalcy bias, the effect of, well, this has been going on forever, so this is just business as usual. I think the fact that if we make a good faith assumption that executives were not fully made aware of this until 1979, whether or not that's true is not clear, but we know 1979 is the latest that they could have known about this. And they've been producing PFAS at scale since 1947. There's absolutely a sense of, well, I mean, we've been doing this for so long, the world hasn't ended. How bad could it really be? And when you look at the long-term impacts of PFAS, things like long-term carcinogenic impact, these are A, very long time horizon events. They don't happen right away. And B, very low visibility. They're probably not seeing that. When I say they, I mean the executives at 3M are probably not seeing the carcinogenic impact. The greatest impact would be in 3M employees who are working on production floors. And to be quite horrifically blunt, by the time these employees are displaying impact from these compounds, they're either retired or if they are experiencing cancer, they're probably not on the production floor. And so this creates a sort of really difficult intertemporal choice. They have this known impact and they have this uncertain impact that has low salience, low visibility, very long time horizon. I hate to say it, but as a pure value calculation, it's not that surprising that they chose to do nothing. I'm not in any way saying that was the appropriate decision, but I'm saying in terms of how their brains process the potential impacts, I do kind of get it.
I do too. And I don't want to sound like a corporate apologist in my comments, but I can put myself in their shoes. And to your point, John, again, they weren't seeing anything as far as impacts until they started testing their own employees, and some of their employees started to get sick. And it really started to hit home when the state of Minnesota uncovered that they had significant amounts of PFAS contamination in all of their operating sites in the state of Minnesota. That all of the groundwater in their sites had reached incredibly toxic levels. It really wasn't until then that I think even the true health impacts of this started to hit home.
And by that point, you have an enormous problem of institutional inertia. It's just been going on for so long. That's what 3M does. 3M makes PFAS products. Even with enormous institutional will, which we didn't see for reasons we've been discussing, even with that will in place, it would take a huge amount of time and resources to turn that ship around. And unsurprisingly, we didn't see that.
That's a great point about institutional inertia. And we see it come up again and again. And that's why, if you want to see significant change, if you want to see a breakthrough, which in this case, you needed a breakthrough in terms of new product development, in terms of new science that would create a more safer version of the types of products that PFAS was spawning. So that tends not to happen in a bigger established company. A bigger established company tends to be focused more on operational excellence and on how to do things quicker, cheaper, and more efficiently. In terms of what really needed to be done for the better of the planet, what needed to be was a smaller, more nimble, a company with less at stake, putting ourselves on the prospect theory curve, a company that really didn't have a lot to lose. And at least as far as we know, there was no such competitor.
Yeah, ultimately, the displacing compounds, the replacement PFAS compounds, really didn't come into place until I don't know the exact timeline, but I believe it was the early 2000s. And even then, I believe it was out of DuPont or 3M's own research. I could be mistaken about that, but it's not as though they've had pressure from external startup competitors. And that does definitely facilitate and indirectly support that kind of institutional inertia.
Yes, because if there's nothing assumed as far as danger in these compounds, then what is the incentive for someone else to come along and create something better?
And I think it might be even more pernicious than nothing assumed in the danger of the compounds. Looking back at some of the records here, in 1999, there were some, I forget who it was. It was a chemical or engineering worker who had a correspondence chain with 3M's general counsel, essentially pushing the executive team, why have you not done anything? And the company said that its studies of 3M workers found no adverse effects. There was a quote that 3M does not believe that any reasonable basis exists to conclude that PFAS present substantial risk to injury or health or to the environment. So this, I think, creates an ongoing internal illusory truth. I don't know if we've talked about this on the podcast as of yet, but our brains aren't really good at detecting truth on its own, so we use the familiarity of a concept as a proxy for the correctness or validity of that concept. And so by saying something over and over and over again, we tend to find it more convincing, even if we know that it is objectively incorrect. I suspect that 3M probably began this pitching of 3M does not believe that any reasonable basis exists to conclude that PFAS is dangerous years back as a defense, as a way of getting external interests to not worry about it. But the danger is that over time, they probably began to believe it themselves. Executive teams who were not working day to day with the science heard this over and over again. And I bet many of them, possibly even all of them, genuinely believed that PFAS presented no danger to the public.
So, John, is this an example of what we talk about in our book, The Narrative Fallacy or Gospel Bias? How should our listeners think about this?
I think it probably spun into both of those. Illusory truth is its own thing. It emerges from processing fluency, that notion that we use familiarity as a proxy for correctness. And then illusory truth is when something incorrect gets repeated sufficiently often that we believe it to be correct. Narrative fallacy, of course, is the observation that a compelling narrative, good storytelling, is far more persuasive, is far more influential than facts and objective analysis. And then gospel bias, I think, definitely applies here. Gospel bias is something that I believe you and I have coined that term. I've not really come across it in the literature, but I stand by it because I do believe it is valid and useful. That as something is received throughout an organization across employment generations from sufficiently high authority, it becomes gospel and it is not to be questioned. That is how things are done. That is how this organization operates. In this case, where minimally going back to 1979, executives said, nope, nothing to see here, move along. Yes, that absolutely acquires the weight of gospel bias.
Which is connected to authority bias because it needs to come from a higher authority or a perceived higher authority within an organization or entity.
Yes, absolutely.
So, in terms of what was going on at 3M, there was an illusory truth that was created. It was stated over and over again, as you mentioned. And then I would go as far as to say, based on some of the other research that our team did, that there was a conscientious effort to maintain that illusory truth using confirmation bias, essentially dismissing studies and facts that contradicted such gospel and embracing anything that would support it, even if it was somewhat tenuous in terms of its fact findings.
Well, that raises an interesting sort of philosophical question, which is, can confirmation bias ever be said to be conscientious and volitional? But in descriptive type, I agree. I think that yes, they definitely were seen to be rejecting or cherry picking at least results that supported the business position that they wanted to take. And all of this feeds into, I think, that core loss aversion, that sense of we're sunk. 3M is entirely screwed if this is genuinely toxic and if the world finds out.
Well, and the reason that I brought up the whole confirmation bias issue is because of the article in the New Yorker from about a year ago, the that largely centered around Chris Hansen, a former scientist who worked for many, many years at 3M, whose father was the second highest ranking scientist when he worked there. So the Hansen family is definitely a big part of 3M's history. When Chris Hansen entered the company, she had a PhD in chemistry, and she did initial tests on PFAS, and in particular, PFAS being in bloodstreams of 3M workers and in others, and found that everywhere she looked, she was finding PFAS contamination in blood samples, regardless of where they were being taken. And there was one higher executive who decided to test her by giving her a blood sample and saying, here, you test this for PFAS. She went ahead and did so and found that there was PFAS in there. And he said, aha, there must be something wrong with your tests because I took this blood sample from a horse. And there's no way that a horse has been around McDonald's or around Scotchgard. So I believe there were some, not saying everybody, but there were some who were actually going to lengths to try to dismiss what well-intended scientists, even within the firm, were finding.
There is definitely a level of self-interest involved there. People didn't want this to be true. Executives, senior leadership, honestly, probably the entirety of the organization had a self-interest in PFAS not being toxic. We look at self-interest bias very often through the lens of senior leadership, but if you are a 3M chemical production manufacturer worker, you have a self-interest in PFAS not being toxic. And we can say, oh, but that doesn't make sense. If you have exposure, why would you not want to have information on that? But we see this all the time in people ignoring or avoiding medical testing because they're afraid they might have something. Self-interest bias is a powerful driver of people ignoring or dismissing or avoiding particular pieces of information. And given the omnipresence of PFAS throughout 3M's product portfolio and from what we've seen throughout the Minnesota groundwater, yeah, arguably the entirety of the 3M organization had self-interest in reports of PFAS toxicity not being true.
I also think there was a certain amount of optimism bias. maybe willful optimism and even some overconfidence. And again, I refer back to Chris Hansen, and I don't want to make this podcast all about her, but she was very forthcoming in terms of her experience at 3M and what she dealt with. And the interesting thing is that even after her work was initially dismissed, including by a CEO who was sleeping during one of her presentations, she still decided to work there for another couple of decades. And when asked why she continued to work there, it's because she believed that PFAS was not that harmful. That even though, yes, it was being found showing up everywhere in everybody's bloodstream, that it wasn't really that dangerous for human beings to ingest. So it was not a problem. And it wasn't until maybe 6 or 7 years ago when the EPA started to put a big press on it and had all the water facilities actually test the water for PFAS levels and put a specific limit on the amount of PFAS that would be deemed safe in drinking water, that she began to realize, oh my God, I've been lied to, and had her optimism turned inside out. So let's talk a little bit about the risk management aspect of this, John, because again, what went wrong and did anything go wrong per se? And in my mind, I think it depends on what the definition of ERM is. And if ERM is designed to protect and bring longevity to a particular organization, then I'm not sure that their actions necessarily spelled out a particular risk management failure. I know that may sound controversial, that may sound very callous and very corporate centric. But again, if you're implementing a risk management program in an entity, it's about making sure that the entity can continue to function, can continue to achieve its mission and objectives, and continue to provide profitability for its owners. And I think the decisions that were made were in that light.
I would agree with that. I'm curious how you're going to respond to this because audiences, Rich and I have specifically avoided discussing this because we know we're coming at this from slightly different angles. I'm curious where you're going to respond on this. I don't know how you use traditional ERM frameworks for this sort of issue. In this case, the violation began in 1947. We typically think about ERM as being useful for things that might occur in the future. How do we use it when the exposure has been ongoing for decades? Is it from the point of realization? Is it from the point of forecast? Or do we need a completely different framework or toolbox when we unearth breaches that are ongoing?
Wow, this could be a whole other episode, John, but I'll take it from two angles. First, when ERM is brought into place, whenever you're implementing an ERM program, and again, we're talking 1947, I don't think there was any formal ERM program in 1947 or even 1967 or 77. But let's say that they put in a formal ERM program around the time that there were the lawsuits with DuPont and the initial findings by the EPA around the turn of the century. I think at that point, you're looking going forward. And what are the risks at that point? Given that you've already been producing this chemical for 5 decades, it's already out in the world. You know there are issues already. What is the best way forward for your entity? And you may look at all of the different risks involved. And I would dare say they did do this. They looked at the biggest risk as the potential for litigation, and that they ranked that as their top risk in terms of preserving the long-term viability of 3M. That if they could minimize the exposure to that risk, that they would be able to continue with their business model and to meet their objectives.
I would agree with that. I think this is an interesting and curious case where we've come across the fact that it's difficult to find a really good definition of risk itself. We encountered this problem when we were writing our textbook, and we found that from book to book, nobody really agrees what risk is. I have my own way of thinking about it, and I know you sometimes agree with it and sometimes don't, where I characterize risk as anything that might happen. By this characterization, the health and environmental impacts are not risk. They've already happened. There's no uncertainty around them. And so, from a traditional, strictly read through ERM framework, you really couldn't include that as part of the ERM potential future outcomes. Now, this is not in any way saying this should not be considered. I'm just saying it's not part of risk by that standard of anything that might happen. Given the time frame of outcomes and impacts, and given the normalcy around everything that happened, you can argue that the real risk exposure event is future discovery. And I think that
Mhm.
agrees with what you were saying in terms of future litigation. And so this raises a very interesting question, I think, of how do you position that? How do you respond to that when, let's make a good faith assumption that a CEO comes into position and has this dropped on their desk. They knew nothing about it prior. I think that's a huge assumption that probably isn't correct, but let's just make that assumption for purposes of this conversation. How then do they make that risk calculation when the source is ongoing and inevitable, but the potential exposure is downstream, and even if they are never caught, the environmental impact is ongoing?
That's an interesting one, John. And this gets to, are you doing ERM for the company or are you doing ERM for a wider stakeholder view? And this is where it gets a little bit philosophical and, what are we doing certain things for and who has the ultimate responsibility? So again, who is management responsible to? Primarily, they're responsible to the owners of the company, which are the shareholders. However, that's a very traditional point of view. It's been more challenged now in recent years, although I think there's been some pushback. The needle tends to go in both directions, but there has been, I think, a general understanding that risk has to be managed for all stakeholders, not just for the owners of the company. And therefore, if you look at things from a standpoint of the public, the government, and suppliers and so forth, then I think you start to get potentially a different risk calculation when you look at it from that standpoint.
That's a really interesting take on things. I'm going to follow that up with a question that I'm going to risk really alienating your boss and putting you on the spot here. But given that, I love that question. What do you do ERM for? Is it for the company or for the wider stakeholders? Given that, and if we land on the fact that it is for, or that at least you have to take into account the wider stakeholders, how much utility is there for more value-based ERM frameworks? Do those still work to the full effect for these kinds of questions?
So, John, I still think they do, but I think you have to modify the calculation. I think it becomes a more complex calculation, frankly, because you need to put in weights for the different stakeholders. You would put different weights on different measures. So you would not just place 100% weight on preserving and growing company value. You would place some weight on it because, again, if you're not preserving value, if you're not growing company value, then you won't attract more capital to your organization. So this is not about shifting 100% in the other direction. It's just about bringing weight into other potential metrics, which would reflect the best interests of other stakeholders.
That does make for a very complex calculation because if you look at that in terms of who's potentially impacted by the production of PFAS in this particular case, your wider stakeholder calculation now encompasses North America.
Well, and it gets to, is that 3M's responsibility? Does 3M have the ultimate say on this? I mean, we can all say they should do the right thing by others and weight these other stakeholders accordingly. That gets to, what was the government doing? And what was the EPA doing? And do they have an obligation to do better testing beyond the FDA and the EPA? The Consumer Product Safety Commission, which I assume is doing testing on all of these different products because most of them are not things that are intended to be ingested in any way, shape, or form. Are they testing for these kinds of chemicals? Where were they in all of this? And I would say, in terms of this more grand view of ERM, that's really in the wheelhouse of government and regulation. And what this says to me is that there was certainly not a lot being done in that respect because this was going on for decades before anybody in a government suit had any awareness of it.
I'm going to push back a little bit on that simply because I've worked in a laboratory and I have some sense of what's involved in laboratory testing. The CPSC and the EPA both rely on two things. One is some level of good faith action by organizations, by companies, and two is faithful acting by whistleblowers within organizations. Just given how much it takes to do even baseline testing of products, and given how many products and how many geographic locations there are out there, practically speaking, it's just not possible for either of these organizations to have complete oversight over everything that's going on. They can do baseline testing for safety, for environmental impact, but unless they know specifically that they need to be looking in a particular location for a particular compound or for a particular impact, realistically, they can't be watchdogs all the time. So, in that sense, I do think we can lay a lot of that responsibility at 3M's feet.
Okay, so now I'm going to push back on you, which is what incentives do we give actors like 3M to encourage whistleblowers to come forward, to do the testing, to be forthcoming in their findings? How do we deal with the understandable loss aversion and self-interest that is going to go on in these organizations? I don't have a good answer off the top of my head, but this is something that I think if we're going to get better behavior from corporations, there's got to be some type of amelioration of any negative consequences of quote unquote doing the right thing.
I agree with that entirely. I see nothing that really directly incentivizes and certainly does not reinforce good behavior by either the organizations themselves or by whistleblowers within the organizations by anything that EPA, CPSC, or really any regulatory body puts forward. And I agree. I think this is a major gap that nobody has really solved yet. I think that these are things that were put in place by regulatory fiat, by aspirational sense that people want to do the right thing, but without any real understanding of human behavior. Let's say you are a whistleblower. Really, what you get is nominal protections that says that you cannot be subject to retaliatory firing if you do bring forward a major concern to one of these bodies. Okay, great. But if you're a 3M scientist, if you're a career 3M scientist, and you bring forward knowledge that, hey, guess what? PFAS is hugely problematic, you're still probably going to end up out of a job because now PFAS is going to be reduced in production, or the company is going to be subject to lawsuits or to government penalties. And very likely your division is going to be downsized. So, okay, 3M hasn't fired you in response, but it's still going against your self-interest. And I agree. I don't think anybody has really cracked this as of yet. You could say, okay, financial incentives, but then employees will be coming forward with nuisance claims in effort to get some sort of whistleblower money if we say that we're going to use financial incentives. I don't know what the good path forward here is.
Yeah, and beyond the fact that, yeah, they might be protected from retaliation by the company, that's still not going to necessarily help them in terms of their career going forward. I mean, their career trajectory is going to take a massive hit. There's significant group dynamics that go on within the company and even outside of the company if they were to try to move somewhere else to get another job. So there's a lot to lose for whistleblowers as well, because once, even though you may have the reputation of being a high integrity type of individual, you're also seen as someone who is quote unquote not necessarily part of the team, that you kind of operate to your own tune.
We've talked a lot about group affinity, and that's a powerful driver. Your working group at your place of employment tends to be a small tribe that you belong to, and loyalty to the tribe is a powerful motivator of behavior. This goes back to survival imperatives. So, yeah, even if you do see bad behavior, even if you are in a position to see that something problematic is occurring, it's got to be really, really bad for you to be willing to go past that sense of, I have an allegiance to these people. They look out for me, so I have to look out for them. And I think that historically, when we do see whistleblowers, what we typically see is it happens because there's been a breakdown in that affinity, that sense of this group is no longer taking care of me, so I have no obligation to take care of them.
That's true, John, and that's been seen again and again in a number of whistleblower cases. Certainly in the case of Enron, we've seen that, and some of the other accounting scandals where a particular high enough level executive who knew enough but was somehow marginalized to a certain degree from the overall group found really no other recourse than to quote unquote go rogue. So there's definitely group dynamics that are at play here. The group affinity concept is a highly important one, and frankly, really important to the overall functioning of an organization trying to do a lot of complex things like a corporation. So there's a lot for our audience to digest here. And as you can sense, neither of us have any definitive answers. What I hope we've done is provoke some deeper thinking about the underlying behaviors, and that quote unquote bad behavior, when you look underneath the surface, has a lot of very understandable behavioral drivers that lead to very difficult decisions, and that the solutions are not necessarily at our fingertips. Where ERM comes into play, what is ERM really responsible for? Who is it ultimately working on behalf of? Those are very, very deep questions. And those are things that we hope our audience will take into consideration as you manage your own entities and try to go forward in terms of making these very difficult decisions in gray areas, which, by the way, don't just happen in consumer goods companies, but happen throughout all types of industries. We would love to hear your feedback and any suggestions you have in terms of trying to improve the underlying dynamic between corporations and their underlying stakeholders beyond owners would be most welcome.
Behavior and Risk is brought to you by Capita Solutions. Behavior and Risk staff includes our research team, Sherry Xu and Jin Zhang, and our editing team, Qingying Gao and Athena Liu. Theme music by Crypt of Insomnia. The opinions presented here are solely those of John Burkhart and Rich Loria and do not represent those of Columbia University, Capita Solutions, or any other organization. We thank you for taking a chance on us today.